Well, good morning, everyone, or good evening for those of you in Asia. I want to welcome everyone to today's Carnegie China Twitter Spaces event. I'm your host, Paul Hanley. I'm the director of Carnegie China, and I'm delighted to be joined by friends and colleagues. This morning, we have as speakers Dr. Evan Medeiros, Dennis Wilder, Amanda Shao, and Dr. Ian Chung. This is part of our ongoing Distinguished Speaker Series, where we bring in experts from around the world to look at ongoing developments in China's foreign policy and bilateral and regional relations. And today we're going to talk about latest developments in U.S. China relations. Before I introduce our speakers this morning, let me just mention a couple kind of housekeeping items. This Twitter Spaces event will be live streamed and recorded, also published as an episode in our China in the World podcast. We will have a Q&A session at the end if time is available for that, so that our audience can ask some questions. And before that, if you have any questions related to what we discuss, please press the comment icon on the bottom right of your screen if you're tuning in through your phone, or you can tweet at Carnegie China with the hashtag AskCC. Post your questions if you're joining us today from a web browser. Okay, let's turn to the discussion. We've got a lot to talk about, a timely topic indeed, and I'm delighted, as I mentioned, to welcome four outstanding scholars and experts. First, Dr. Evan Medeiros. He's a professor and Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I should also mention he's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's got a unique blend in terms of his background of regional expertise and government experience. He spent 6 years, more than 6 years, in fact, I think, on the staff of the National Security Council under President Obama, first as director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then as special assistant to the president and senior director for Asia. And in his latter role, he was President Obama's top advisor on the Asia Pacific. Prior to the White House, he spent 7 years with the Rand Corporation, and also during that time had an opportunity to serve in the Treasury Department under Hank Paulson, then Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, on the U.S. China Strategic Economic Dialogue. So Evan's got quite a bit of experience. Thanks, Evan, for joining. Next, we have Dennis Wilder, former colleague of mine from the National Security Council. He's currently a senior fellow for the Initiative for U.S. China Dialogue on Global Issues at Georgetown University, where he previously served as the managing director of that initiative. As I mentioned, Dennis served on the National Security Council as well, also as China director. We have 3 former China directors on this call, including myself. Dennis was China director from 2004 to 2005, and then he was also, like Evan, the special assistant to the president and senior director for East Asian Affairs under President George W. Bush from 2005 to 2009. He also served 30-plus years career in the CIA, and one of his final positions was as the Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. He also served as the senior editor for the President's Daily Brief, which is the worldwide intelligence update produced under the auspices of the Director of National Intelligence that the President and his senior cabinet members and senior staff receive on a daily basis. Next, going to the region, we've got 2 outstanding experts from Southeast Asia. Amanda Shao is with Crisis Groups. She's a senior analyst for China there. Amanda focuses on security issues where China plays a key role. She also looks at developments in China's foreign policy, and especially those that relate to conflict prevention and resolution. Prior to the Crisis Group, Amanda established and managed the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, the China program in Beijing for that effort, which and oversaw projects related to the South China Sea, U.S.-China relations, and China's evolving approach to conflict mediation. So it's a real honor for us to have Amanda joining this morning. Thanks, Amanda, for joining. And last but not least, in Singapore, we have Dr. Ian Chong, who, in addition to being an associate professor of political science at the National University of Singapore, he is also, might proudly add, non-resident scholar at Carnegie, China, where he examines U.S. China dynamics, competitive dynamics in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, and the broader Asia Pacific. Ian received his PhD from Princeton. He's taught at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and his research covers the intersection of international and domestic politics with a focus on the externalities of major power competition. So we've got a great lineup this morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I will start out with one question and ask each of you to respond just to sort of get us, maybe we'll start out by kind of level setting the U.S.-China relationship. I want to get a sense from each of you where you see the current state of the relationship. We've seen in recent months, high-level U.S. dialogue has resumed. Secretary of State Blinken visited last month, went to Beijing this month in July. We've had Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. The climate envoy, John Kerry, is in Beijing now. I'd like to get a sense from each of you how you would describe the current state of the relationship and what impact will this renewed diplomatic contact, this renewed dialogue have? Can it help to stabilize the bilateral relationship, or will this positive impact of these visits be short-lived? And I will turn to start with Dr. Evan Medeiros. Evan, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And it's a particular professional pleasure to be part of a panel with a variety of close friends and colleagues. So, Paul, you asked, where are we in the U.S.-China relationship? I think the best that we can say is that we're in a period of reconnection. Where that reconnection takes us is still a big open question. I think the reconnection stopped the deterioration that had been occurring in the first and second quarter of this year. But whether that reconnection opens a new phase in the relationship, I think is a big open question. And I chose the word reconnection very deliberately because it's simply a process of U.S. officials and Chinese officials and business people and scholars and students starting to interact with each other more. But of course, the core of the relationship is a series of competitive dynamics. And I think the broader process that's going on in the relationship is one that I consider to be negotiating competition. Both sides are exploring the different areas of competition, trying to understand the areas of relative importance, what risks, what costs are important to the other side, what the boundaries are. And I think we're going to be in this period of negotiating competition for quite a while, absent an exogenous shock like the spy balloon incident that leads to a rapid deterioration. So it's about reconnection. It's a fragile reconnection. And both sides are very much oriented toward negotiating the terms of competition. That's where I think we are today. Over to you, Paul.
Great, Evan. Thank you very much. I mean, I hear from your comments, in a sense, and I hope I'm right, you're saying we need to be realistic, really, about what this is, and not sort of over-interpret. This is, as you've described, a reconnection. But yet the competitive dynamics still exist, and the two sides will be, in a sense, negotiating things moving forward. And so time will tell. Ian, I'd like to turn to you, if I could, to get a Southeast Asian perspective on this. I'd like to know how you see it, and then, how do you see Evan's description? Does that make sense to you, or do you have different perspectives on that?
Thanks, Paul. First off, I'd like to thank you again for putting this panel together. I'm really honored to be here. So I guess in terms of the broad description of events, I would agree with Evan, but I think the read might be somewhat different, or at least there's a variety of views in Southeast Asia. I think there is a sigh of relief that there is more contact. And with those people who sort of are in that category, there's a hope that U.S. PRC relations would get better from here on. Whether that's the case or not, I think it's too early to tell. There I agree with Evan. There are others, and I'm actually a little bit more sympathetic to this view, which is, okay, the contact means that perhaps there, for now, is a sort of a floor to U.S.-China competition in the sense that there's some way to address the potential of miscalculation, the potential for unintended escalation. It's not a hard floor, but at least there's something. Maybe it's a guardrail. It's tentative right now, but there's something. There's no sort of concrete proposal for cooperation put out there, but that's okay for now. I suppose there are others who sort of are a little bit more anxious, who feel that, okay, so we have this contact for now, but are we going to see a balloon incident? Are we going to see some other exogenous shock, as Evan so nicely put it, that will throw things into disarray again? And there's this, I guess, to understand that view, I mean, smaller actors in the region feel that they have less role to play, and there is more concern about sort of caught in between when the major powers go at each other. So yeah, let me stop there for now.
Great, Ian. Thank you so much. Important to get a perspective from the region, and what I hear you saying is, in a sense, there's been quite a bit of concern at the state of the U.S.-China relationship, and as you said, while we need to be realistic, there's a bit of a sigh of relief in the region and a hope that the U.S. and China can get things on a better footing. Dennis, let me turn to you and be interested to know your perspectives, but whether you have any different views or whether you agree with what's been said so far.
Thanks, Paul. I think that I'd make 3 quick points. First of all, I agree with everything that's been said. One, very fragile. The good news is that we're talking to each other again. I think it's important to point out that, for example, with Yellen's visit, we began to see Chinese officials that we don't know who are now in the important positions. And so she got time with her counterpart, who really is something of a mystery to Americans and other foreigners. And I think if Raimondo goes, that will also begin to create ties to Chinese officials that have taken up positions after the Party Congress and the National People's Congress. So I think this is an important aspect. The fragility is very much there, and the Taiwan election coming up, of course, could be a spark for new problems in the relationship. Like the balloon incident, we could have something blow up that is unforeseen in the relationship. So I wouldn't get too optimistic at this point. A final point I would just make is right now it's all Americans going to China and no senior Chinese coming to the United States. That needs to change if we're going to see this stabilize. And so far, there have been no announcements or no indications that any members of Xi Jinping's cabinet are coming to Washington. And I think that shows that this is a very fragile reset of the relationship.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I think that that word "fragile" is a good word to describe what we've got here. And you note it's very important that we're beginning to meet officials we don't know, and Raimondo's visit, if she visits soon, can do the same thing. But important not to get too optimistic. Amanda, Dennis mentioned the Taiwan issue. I mean, you're normally sitting, as I understand it, in Taiwan. How do you see the state of the U.S.-China relationship, and how does being in Taiwan impact some of your assessment?
Thanks, Paul, and it's an honor to be included, so thank you very much for setting this up. Just a quick note on the overall U.S.-China relationship. So picking up on what Evan was saying about setting or finding the terms of the relationship, I totally agree with that. And I think for me, what's going to be interesting is I think there's going to be a probing that will be ongoing of how far the other side will go on both the competitive and the cooperative front. And there's going to be an attempt to see the degree to which each side can influence the policy of the other side during this period of time. So what was to me telling about this Kerry's visit, is that, of course, China has always been opposed to the U.S. proposal to both compete and to cooperate at the same time. So I think it'll be interesting to watch and see how far cooperation on climate change can actually go. We've seen already today that Xi is sending signals that, in fact, China will be pursuing climate change at its own pace. And we saw that Wang Yi in his statement, in the Chinese statement of the meeting between Wang Yi and Kerry, that this reminder that cooperation on climate change can't be separated from the broader environment of the Chinese-U.S. relationship. So I think that's something to watch to see if there's any sort of adjustment on the Chinese side. And from the perspective of Taiwan, as Dennis had mentioned, Taiwan is very focused internally right now on its presidential elections. I think, to some extent, having a more stable U.S.-China relationship is beneficial to Taiwan. Taiwan hasn't fully been in the driver's seat of certain developments in the last year or in the last couple of months. So I think to some extent, there's probably a degree of relief around that. But of course, Taiwan will be watching closely the ways in which the U.S. talks about Taiwan in these meetings. There was some reporting in the media around the fact that Blinken had said in Beijing that the U.S. doesn't support Taiwan independence, which of course is longstanding policy, but nevertheless, there will be sort of murmurs around that in Taipei.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I like your description, probing. Start to two sides to do probing in terms of the competition and the cooperation. And the first article I read this morning when I woke up was something related to what you mentioned, where I saw that John Kerry in Beijing has been encouraging the Chinese side to separate climate change from the broader politics of the U.S.-China relationship, and whether or not the Chinese are in a position to do that, to me, is still unclear. And that leads actually into my next question, and I'll ask a couple of you, and then maybe we'll move on to other questions. And if I don't ask you a particular question, but you want to come back to it in answering another question, feel free to do that. The Biden administration has clearly made the maintaining lines of communication a key pillar of what they want to do with China. They talk about the strategic competition and that they see that intensifying, and the rivalry is also intensifying. But at the same time, President Biden talks about guardrails, talks about the importance of dialogue, talks about the importance of crisis management mechanisms. Prior to Secretary of State Blinken's visit, the Chinese, it seemed to me, were playing a bit hard to get. And Kurt Campbell recently said there was a period following the balloon incident in February where the Chinese would simply not engage with the U.S. And it got to the point where the Biden administration was seeking dialogue with the Chinese, and the Republicans were accusing them of being desperate for dialogue. Something's changed. China obviously has hosted Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of the Treasury Yellen, John Kerry this month, and there are reports, as Dennis mentioned, that Raimondo will go soon. So I'm just interested, and I'll start with Evan. How do you assess these dynamics in China? What's behind kind of the cool posture of the Chinese, and then the shift to be more willing to engage? Is it related to the poor state of their economy? Is it somehow related to President Xi wanting to attend APEC in the U.S. and laying the foundation for, at least in the short term, a better relationship? What is going on in China in terms of the politics that leads China to take this posture that we've seen?
Well, Paul, you've asked the key question, hard question to answer. My instinct is that there's two dynamics going on, one domestic dynamic in China and one external dynamic related to their relationship with the United States. So the domestic dynamic in China, I think, has to do first and foremost with the balloon incident. I think the Chinese were surprised, embarrassed, and, it's notable to many Americans that the Chinese posture was to basically deny and deflect, right? And so that just extended well into the first half of this year, the period where they really weren't engaging, as Kurt Campbell said. I mean, it's striking to me that the U.S. was without a Chinese ambassador in Washington from, I believe, about October. But Paul, please correct me, October of 2022 when Qin Gang left for the Party Congress in China, until the new ambassador, Xie Feng, arrived literally just a few weeks ago. Now, I don't know if that gap is the historic high. In other words, we've never had another period, that long without a U.S. ambassador, but it was a long period. So I think part of it was domestic politics and the Chinese wanting to, deflect responsibility and sort of project this image of a hard line. Paul, you'll recall that during the National People's Congress meeting in March, I believe it was March 7th or 8th, Xi Jinping very famously called out the United States for containment, suppression, and encirclement. That's pretty unique language for him to name the U.S. And then, attribute those very three competitive strategies. So when you've got the top guy saying the U.S. is engaging in containment, suppression, and encirclement, that system is not one that's going to be open to engagement, right? The very opposite. So I think there's domestic dynamics, and there's probably an element that you hinted to in your question, which is politically, it's hard to believe that Xi Jinping doesn't face some headwinds from their poor management of zero COVID and presumably lots of complications and deaths associated from that sort of rapid abandonment of zero COVID. Of course, the fact that the economy has not performed as anticipated. The Chinese got 1 quarter of consumption-driven growth, not really 2. Industrial activity is way down. Employment, especially youth and unemployment, is high. So you can imagine domestic political incentives to, deflect, a lot of blame and responsibility on the United States and sort of rally around the Communist Party and the leadership in the face of external pressure. So I think that's one dynamic. Second dynamic is related to this negotiating competition dynamic that I mentioned in my opening. Basically, I think the Chinese are searching for leverage in their relationship with the United States. And they're trying to figure out how to push the U.S. off what they see as a very competitive strategy. And I think the Chinese have been surprised by the gains the U.S. has made in Europe, in Asia, most recently with the Philippines. I think they've been especially surprised by the embrace of industrial policy in the investments at home. I've had Chinese scholars say to me, that's what we do. That's not what you do. And so I think that they're trying to find ways to get the U.S. to back off some of its strategies. And one way to do that is to put at risk one thing that they know the United States wants, which is dialogue, communication, and risk management. And the Chinese are trying to demonstrate, and I think they did with some of their unsafe and unprofessional intercepts, that they're willing to assume more risk as a way to try and push the U.S. off some of its strategies. So I think this sort of search for leverage. And final point here is, I think that is in part what's motivating their response to Kerry, which is we are not going to compartmentalize climate change cooperation from the broader relationship. If you want our cooperation on this thing that you value, working together to reduce greenhouse gases, then you're going to have to give us something for it, right? And that's hence Wang Yi's statement about how you can't de-link climate change cooperation. And as you know, Paul, as you and Dennis and others will know well, the history of the U.S.-China relationship, the last 44 years, is littered with examples of compartmentalization, right? It's a tried and tested technique for managing such a diverse and complex relationship. And so I think that the unwillingness of the Chinese to compartmentalize now is a reflection of the search for leverage when they've been surprised at the gains that the U.S. has made. Full stop there. Over to you.
Great, Evan. Thank you. You've put a lot out there, and I think really important points. And I think, you know, your point about President Xi's comments at the National People's Congress, I think we've underappreciated that to a certain extent, calling out the U.S. for the first time for containment, suppression, encirclement. And of course, those reverberate through the Chinese system and are studied at all levels and will be taken into account. So I agree with you. I think that creates some dynamics that make it hard to shift to more engagement with the U.S. I want to turn to our experts in Southeast Asia. I'll start with Ian. Feel free to comment on anything that Evan mentioned. I'd be particularly interested in your view on his point that the Chinese may be using dialogue, communication, risk management as leverage with the United States as they search for leverage and may be willing to assume more risk. And also the point about the Chinese being, you know, not willing to separate the cooperation piece, even in areas where, you know, it's clearly global public good, not able to separate, not willing to separate that from the broader political and diplomatic dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship. Ian, over to you.
Thanks. So I'm in broad agreement with Evan, but what I will add is that the dynamic that's particularly interesting to me is the fact that when the PRC sends out signals, as we've described earlier, they can't isolate these signals, right? And what they're trying to tell the U.S. can be read by other actors and interpreted in different ways. So why I bring this up is because for a really long time, a lot of voices in Southeast Asia were saying, hey, you know, the U.S., you really got to stop provoking the PRC. I mean, there's some sort of taking in of that PRC line that the U.S. is particularly provocative. But when there's this evidence, right, that first, the PRC is willing to take on risk, and the U.S. is actually making efforts to reach out. Whether there's any success to that reaching out is a different story. But the U.S. reaching out suggests that, hey, you know what? Maybe it's the case that the PRC doesn't really want to talk. The U.S. may be trying. In that case, maybe some of that pressure needs to be put on Beijing, or perhaps the U.S. may be the more reasonable actor to work with. And I think this explains some of those gains. And so Beijing, I think, is trying to calibrate between that. Plus, I think the greater transparency over PRC unsafe actions over the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan has also created a sense that, hey, events that people used to compartmentalize, actually, you know, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, they're actually very similar, and there's a lot more commonality. So PRC behavior, you know, probably needs to be recalibrated a bit to assure its neighbors. So I think in that light, the PRC's relative receptiveness to the U.S. perhaps comes with some realization on their part that, hey, you know, we want to push, maybe we want to push the U.S. hard, but while we do that, we got to also be careful not to isolate or to push potential partners away. So that's something that at least I think I'm sort of seeing signals of in sort of my neck of the woods, which could be quite different from elsewhere. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. And so ultimately, there are external. I mean, Secretary of State Blinken recently commented on the fact that the U.S. Biden administration is receiving that they see an international demand signal for more constructive, better U.S.-China relations. That there's concern out there that the U.S.-China relationship may be coming too confrontational, potential for conflict too high, and that the Biden administration has taken into account. I hear you saying to a certain degree that the Chinese may be susceptible some to that pressure as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Because they don't want to be isolated, right? That's if they are concerned about this containment, suppression, and encirclement. Well, one way to address it is to sort of find friends. So I think they are probably aware of those sorts of issues.
Don't want to be seen also as the provocative actor in the U.S. China piece, especially in the region. Dennis, over to you. Your perspectives on this, and in that context. How do you think these two visits, both Yellen and Kerry, when it comes to the Chinese side, will this be a positive? Will it have a positive impact? Will we see the Chinese begin to do more, willingness to do more with the U.S. side, or will you expect to still see this kind of cool reception where the Chinese, as Evan said, are seeking to use the dialogue channels with the U.S. as leverage?
Thanks, Paul. I think one thing we should be looking for, and I gather I've just been looking online, Kerry's visit is not quite yet done. And one of the things that will tell us something is if the U.S. China Working Group on Climate Change is reinitiated with this visit. If it isn't, I think it's a strong signal that the Chinese are still playing hard to get with us, that they're not ready yet to reopen these channels. So I think that is going to be an indicator, and a pretty strong indicator of where we are. It is interesting that Xi Jinping had a meeting on the subject of climate change while Kerry was there. And of course, as was said earlier, it was rather to say that we are taking an independent course. I think one thing I'd like to add to the discussion, and I agree with a great deal of what's just been said. I think one other aspect of why the Chinese have been playing hard to get is I think they were shocked by how far the administration went on semiconductors, on what was sort of termed decoupling at the beginning. Now it's de-risking. But at a time when the Chinese economy was just coming out of zero COVID, the U.S. really did hit them with the hardest sanction ever. And I believe it's going to have much more impact than people think it's going to have on Chinese high-tech and emerging technology development. I think the other shock for them on this front was that our allies came to our side, the Europeans came to our side on some of this, and certainly on the semiconductors, the Netherlands and others fell in line with us. And so I think the Chinese are very worried about how far we will go. There are more shoes to drop. The outbound investment executive order is to come. There are thoughts of other areas of emerging technology where the restrictions will be increased. And so I think this is a big factor that is continuing. It's not something that's over on the U.S. side. Again, there are more shoes to drop. And the Chinese, I think, are very worried about how far we're going to go.
Very good points. Thank you, Dennis. And I think it's important you raise the issue of the semiconductor sanctions in October. And as Evan said, as the Chinese search for leverage in responding to that, they have a bit of a double-edged sword if they respond by punishing U.S. companies because they're trying to signal to the world they're open for business. They want international companies to stay engaged. So their leverage in that space can be somewhat limited. And so then, holding out on dialogue is one area potentially where they can, as Evan said, they know the U.S. wants the dialogue. And so, anytime there's something that the U.S. side is looking for, Chinese side could see that as leverage. I want to get Amanda's perspective on this question, but I also, Amanda, want to also veer into a new set of issues related around the number of close encounters that we've seen between the U.S. and Chinese military assets in the air and at sea over the last few months. The risk of an inadvertent crisis seems to be growing. China is becoming more assertive in harassing or pushing back on U.S. Operations in the South China Sea and elsewhere in the region. And they've been reluctant to engage in efforts to build crisis communication mechanisms that the Biden administration has been pushing. And so I'm interested to get a sense from you in the military context, why the reluctance on the Chinese side? Are there different dynamics at play here that we need to highlight, especially around the crisis management mechanisms? It has been open to dialogue now with Blinken, Yellen, Kerry, and others. I should note that Henry Kissinger is in Beijing, 100 years old. He's in Beijing, and he had a meeting apparently with the U.S. sanctioned defense minister, Li Shangfu. Li Shangfu, of course, did not meet with the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June, even though the U.S. side was willing to do that meeting because they, in principle, were not open to a meeting at a time where their defense minister was sanctioned. But what's your sense, Amanda, on the broader set of questions that we've been talking about, but also in the military context around these crisis management mechanisms? Why the reluctance on the Chinese side?
Thanks, Paul. I mean, really, you should be the one talking about this, but let me give it a go. So first, in terms of the dangerous and risky encounters and interceptions that we've seen, I like to describe it really as it's a form of struggle on the part of the Chinese, calibrated escalation to show to the U.S. the risks and the costs of maintaining U.S. military presence and activities in China's peripheries at frequencies that they object to. And here, what's important is that I do think that the Chinese believe that it is calibrated, meaning that there is an assumption here that these encounters and interceptions that are a form of political signaling won't ultimately spiral out of control. And I think that's concerning and an underestimation of the risks. Now, in terms of mill-to-mill dialogue and the reluctance that we've seen on the Chinese side, one, to engage in high-level military or defense dialogue, and to engage sincerely, I think, in discussing crisis management mechanisms. So I think fundamentally the Chinese see it as more in the U.S. interest than it is in theirs to engage in these forms of discussions. They continue to be skeptical. They believe that engaging in these sorts of discussions, that if it actually makes progress, it will reduce risk for the U.S. It will provide more clarity to the U.S. and therefore encourage more behavior from the U.S. that they don't want to see. Namely the American military presence and activities close to China. I think fundamentally there's, similar to attitudes, I think, in Washington, there's also a fundamental skepticism that dialogue will change U.S. behavior. And so in a way, the Chinese simply don't see it as very much in their interest. I think one thing that's a sort of Chinese expert told me a long time ago that still, I think, resonates here is that, military to military interactions and dialogue have always been seen by the Chinese as a low-cost tool for political signaling. So to them, it's low cost to not engage in these interactions.
Great. Those are a great set of comments. Thank you very much, Amanda. And I think your point, and I've heard this from the Chinese side, that in a sense, setting up these crisis management mechanisms from a Chinese perspective will only allow, in their view, the U.S. to continue to do aggressive military operations and maneuvers, but yet give them a fallback in the event that something happens. And the Chinese see that as a disincentive. This is something that we hear more and more on the Chinese side. In terms of, Evan used this term exogenous shock, which I think is a great phrase. And as I think through some of those that we might talk about and the potential impact, I note that North Korea fired 2 ballistic missiles yesterday. We now have a U.S. service member who has fled to North Korea through the Panmunjom Joint Security Area. So North Korea continues to conduct provocative actions, yet it doesn't seem as though a lot is taking place in terms of policy approach from the U.S. or others. When Dennis and I were in the Bush administration, this was an area of cooperation between the U.S. and the Chinese side. During Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Beijing in June, he did mention the prospect of U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea. I will note most people are quite skeptical of that. But I'd like to turn maybe to Dennis, if I could, because you and I have talked about this recently, and I was interested in some of your perspectives. I mean, what's your sense? Is it possible for the U.S. and China to cooperate on North Korea going forward? How will these provocations by North Korea impact Northeast Asian security if the U.S. and China are not able to cooperate?
Yeah, Paul, I think this is a neglected problem in East Asia, and frankly, I think it has more potential right now for a crisis situation than the Taiwan Strait situation has. One of the things I don't know that people have focused on is 2 times this spring, and the latest was on July 12th, the North Koreans tested a full-range ICBM capable of hitting all of the United States. This ICBM is large enough to hold 4 warheads on each missile that is fired. It's also mobile and solid propellant. What all this means is that our ground-based interceptors that we have in Alaska and California are no longer the defense that they once were, because with only 12 of these missiles fired, they can overwhelm our ground-based interceptors, which is not the situation that was in place before. Now, how soon the North Koreans will deploy such a capability is a question I can't answer, but it's an indicator of just how far Kim has gone and how dangerous this situation's getting. So he can not only threaten tactically with blackmail South Korea and Japan, but he can strategically now blackmail the United States to some extent. And of course, this is an unpredictable leader and an unpredictable situation. I only go into all of that to say we need to try with the Chinese. Whether or not we are going to be successful, we have got to be more serious in engaging the Chinese on this issue, because it is getting to a point where it could become extremely dangerous. And I don't see Kim backing away from any of these things. And so I think that we need to make it clear to the Chinese that it is in their self-interest to move ahead with us on this subject. The South Koreans are talking about nuclear weapons of their own. The Japanese have talked some about it. Northeast Asia is becoming a very volatile situation, and I think we are not paying enough attention to the diplomatic side. We are certainly paying a lot of attention to the military side and bolstering capabilities in South Korea and Japan. But I'm worried about diplomatic neglect.
Thank you, Dennis. Your point is getting more and more dangerous, and at the same time, the prospects for U.S.-China cooperation seem to be getting more and more slim. And as you and I discussed the other day, in the Bush administration, geopolitics was always there between the U.S. and China. but it was sort of in the background on the North Korea issue. It was really more about a joint effort at denuclearization. Now, geopolitics seems to be the biggest component affecting a cooperation. Are there any steps that the U.S. side could take to show more seriousness in dealing with the North Korea issue as they begin to think through approaching China?
Well, I think that the fact that we have a part-time negotiator, and I have no trouble with Sun Kim, by the way, I think he's a terrific guy, but he's ambassador to Indonesia and our negotiator. I think that sends a signal in and of itself of our seriousness. I think we ought to have a full-time negotiator. I also think that we need to do things we did in the Bush administration, which was to highlight the North Korean human rights problem much more than we're doing today. That problem has not changed. The situation for the North Korean people is atrocious. And I'm not seeing this administration really taking efforts to highlight that problem. And I think that is part of a strategy when you're dealing with North Korea, and an important part of it.
Thank you for that. Very, very important points. Sort of in the category of exogenous shock, more of a domestic situation for China, but potentially impacting the U.S.-China relationship, are these rumors that the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs is sick or missing, or at least he's out of the question, out of visibility over the last few weeks. He's not been seen since June 25th. He missed the 13th East Asia Forum Summit. Wang Yi attended that instead of Foreign Minister Qin Gang. He's not been seen at other high-level important events, and the foreign ministry spokesman has said that he's sick. Others have said sort of speculation around extramarital affairs, which run against party ethics. A lot of rumors. I want to turn to Evan, if I could, to get a sense of what you think is happening and what impact that'll have on the U.S.-China relationship.
Thanks, Paul. So I don't have any unique or special insight on what's happening, but if there's a change in the Chinese foreign minister, obviously that is an additional challenge to improving U.S.-China communication. I mean, I agree with Dennis that the U.S. and China need to do more on North Korea. But the question I have for Dennis is, Dennis, what do you do when China's not interested in engaging on North Korea? North Korea is not interested in engaging on the nuclear question. So perhaps I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the Biden approach because they've tried with the Chinese, and the Chinese response is, well, what's it worth to you? If you want to have a, quote, strategic discussion on North Korea, we're happy to do it. Are you prepared to, for example, give up your outbound investment EO? I mean, the Chinese very much in their search for leverage are looking for trade-offs. And I think that they're very happy to use growing American concern about the Korean Peninsula to try and elicit things from the United States. I don't think we should play that game on North Korea. I don't think we should give China anything. But it does create a situation where the Chinese won't engage, the North Koreans won't engage, and so the U.S. is left with working with Japan and Korea. And I think in particular, the extended deterrence dialogues have been good and important steps. So I think that I completely share your assessment about the growing risks of instability on the Korean Peninsula. Kim has been quiet for a very long time, and as you and Paul know from your time at the NSC, that's always a concern when the North Koreans go quiet, because you sort of wonder what's coming around the corner. So I think that you're right. We're entering into a precarious time. I think the U.S.-China reconnection is very fragile, and I worry that as our concern about the Korean Peninsula grows, the Chinese will just try to use that, manipulate that as a way to get concessions from us in order to simply talk with them. Final point is the trend in China's relationship with North Korea is just closer and closer in the last several years. And And so it's not clear to me, even if we start talking with the Chinese, that there's some meeting of the minds to further constrain North Korea or to try and put limits on their nuclear and missile programs. So, even the prospects for diplomacy, I think, are, quite austere. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Evan, and I'll let Dennis respond, but I want to just and then I'm going to turn to Ian. I agree with both of you on the growing risks that North Korea presents. As Dennis knows, we talked about this recently. I also agree, Evan, with you that the Chinese are far from considering any cooperation with the United States for a variety of reasons, several of which we discussed. And so I think the prospects there are pretty slim. One of the things Dennis and I talked about the other day is, in addition to Japan and Korea, is there more that you can do with others in the region if China is not willing to cooperate? Can you do more with the Quad? Can you do more? Dennis mentioned Singapore. Is there, because we, have talked about the growing risks, those aren't going away, they're getting more intense. Are there other arrangements that can be brought to bear on the North Korea question is one question that I would ask. But Dennis, let me see if you want to have any response for Evan before.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I believe me, having dealt with the Chinese and the North Koreans, I have no illusions of the ease of doing this. Let me be a little bit of a hardliner here and say I think we haven't used sanctions enough on the Chinese over North Korea. There are banking issues. There are companies, there are individuals that could easily be sanctioned by the United States for their activities with North Korea. And I think threatening, to some extent, more of that with the Chinese would be part of trying to put pressure on them. But I don't disagree with both of you that this is a very tough thing to get moving with the Chinese. I just think it's an imperative. I just think we can't let it stop us.
Thank you, Dennis. Ian, Amanda, let me turn to Ian first, and then Amanda, just anything to add on this set of questions that we've been discussing.
So just quickly, I think one of the things that has come up is this talk about deterrence, right? So I think with Japan and Korea, South Korea, and also the Quad, perhaps one of the things that has to happen with not just North Korea, but in response to more provocative Chinese behavior is a focus on deterring activity and behavior that might be more destabilizing. Now, I'll caveat this by saying that this kind of talk makes Southeast Asian states generally, Singapore included, very, very nervous. Part of it is because they are less accustomed to this sort of competitive dynamic that, I guess for the Northeast Asians and so on, they've had a lot more experience with. But they could free ride from it. So if there is no sort of strong objection from Southeast Asia voices, deterrence could be used to set a sort of floor by saying, okay, well, this is the status quo we want to keep. These are the behaviors we want to discourage. And from there, maybe there can be a cooperation. It would be potentially a little an approach that could get a little bit of friction, but it could actually work out. So I guess I put that out there for consideration.
Thank you, Ian. Great point. Amanda, anything you want to add on this set of questions?
Yeah, maybe just two quick points. Just one, I totally agree. I think it's unlikely that there will be cooperation, but also just to note that, the way that the Chinese see it is that it would come at a cost to them also to sort of rein in the North Koreans, a cost to their political capital with them, and relations have gotten better. And the Chinese see the DPRK as, I think, more strategically important now. And then number two, I think the other thing that's going to affect that calculation is what happens between ROK Japan and the U.S. on the security cooperation front, since on the face of it, that cooperation is about the North Korean threat.
Thank you, Amanda. We've got just 5 minutes left, and I I want to turn to political events coming up here, elections in Taiwan and elections in the U.S., presidential elections in the United States and Taiwan, and get a sense from you the impact that you think this will have on the U.S.-China relationship. And I'll ask Amanda and Ian, if I could, to focus on the Taiwan election, and maybe Dennis and Evan to focus on the U.S. election. In Taiwan, the current polling that I saw recently showed William Lai of the DPP and Ho Yi of the KMT with about 30% each. Ko Wen-je, the TPP, about 20%. Be interested, Ian and Amanda, in your view of how this will play out. Obviously, hard to predict, but what are the risks that we should be thinking about over the next several months leading up to the election in January? And then on the U.S. side, obviously, we've seen several GOP candidates now just held a series of interviews with Tucker Carlson last week. They've outlined their main policy priorities. China came up in some of that, mostly as an argument that the U.S. should be focused less on Ukraine and pushing back on Russia and more on pushing back on China. But broadly speaking, Evan, Dennis, in the last 5 minutes here, how do you expect the upcoming presidential election 2024 to impact bilateral relationships? And how do you see the main differences between the Democrats and the Republicans on China? Let me start, if I could, with Amanda. I'll turn then to Ian, then to Dennis, and then to Evan to wrap up.
So on Taiwan, I think, so first, pre-elections and post-elections. I think pre-elections, I think what has happened and what we have seen this year so far is that Taiwan's presidential elections have resulted in all three parties being more cautious and more moderate in their undertakings, which has had the effect of a marginal cooling down of the sort of escalatory dynamic that we've seen in the Taiwan Strait. And that's very much because Beijing has, since the start of this year, been on a sort of charm offensive with the Taiwanese. They don't want to come off as overly provocative out of a concern that is going to steer the conversation within Taiwan to favor the DPP, which is the party that they would prefer not to be reelected, to put it in a very simple way. And as for Washington, I think the goal here is to remain discreet and to not take any sides during this sort of campaigning. The best example of this, I won't get into it, is how the three sides managed the McCarthy-Tsai meeting. So that's one example of it. But once the election takes place and we have a new Taiwan president, the dynamic, the three-way dynamic, the cross-strait dynamic, it will be in a state of flux, I think, for a period of time. So regardless of who wins, there are a lot of question marks over how they will govern, how they will manage the cross-strait situation. None of them have the level of cross-strait experience that Tsai had when she entered into office, and they don't have that much national security experience either. And as you noted, Lai is in the lead. Ho of the KMT is trailing in the polls. I think so. For instance, even if we assume that Lai will win, I think for a period of time there's going to be a lot of waiting and seeing by Beijing, partly because there is another unknown, the U.S. presidential elections, and there will be a testing period when they see how far they can get with Lai, and the interactions that come out of that will then determine sort of the state of tensions afterwards.
Thank you, Amanda. That's terrific. Ian, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm in broad agreement with Amanda. I'd say that the other thing that we'll have to watch is basically all three candidates so far have not really touched on the whole 92 consensus, one China, different interpretations issue that much. One of the reasons is because it doesn't have much of a market among the Taiwanese electorate. And that's been one of those, big points that she has really pushed. So right now, I think Beijing is trying to be less provocative, but given that the Taiwan electorate doesn't want to go where Beijing wants it to go, post-election, that sort of settling in period, we could see some testing, some friction that can potentially be a little bit escalatory. That probably has to be handled. But the other point I wanted to sort of come in on is that apart from the presidential election, it's also worth watching the legislative election, because whoever becomes president, whether their party has enough seats in the legislature to make sure that their policies, their budget, their laws get passed smoothly is going to be pretty important as well. Insofar as you have a legislature that's behind the president, they can more effectively move towards, say, if it's the DPP, amping up Taiwan's defense. If it's on the KMT side, maybe making overtures to the PRC. So that stuff is also at play. It's not just the presidential election.
Thank you, Ian. Good point on the 92 consensus. Dennis will remember in 2008, Ma Ying-jeou won the election and immediately embraced the 92 consensus, the stabilizing effect that had. I can't imagine a KMT candidate will do the same if he wins. So what will happen there is a big question. Dennis and Evan, we've come up on time, but quick comments, if you could, on the presidential election with respect to the U.S.-China relationship. I'll start with you, Dennis, and we'll end with Evan.
Thanks, Paul. I think that the key point for me here is that the election and the Republican criticism makes the Biden administration have to walk a very careful line. They have to show that they're effectively managing China, but they can't look like they're kowtowing to Beijing. And already you're seeing the Republicans say all these visits to Beijing are simply us as the supplicant going to the Chinese. So I think it will be difficult for the Biden administration to make progress in U.S.-China relations because they are constrained by not wanting to look weak on China, wanting to look like they're taking a forceful stance. For example, I'll just give one example. APEC in San Francisco, under normal circumstances, I would argue that Xi Jinping would be invited to Washington after that visit. But I can't see that happening in the current political environment. I'll stop there.
Great comments. Thank you, Dennis. Evan, over to you.
Fully agree with everything that's been said. I'll end on a broader point, Paul, which is I think we've entered an era in the U.S.-China relationship where domestic politics in both the United States and in China are going to have an outsized influence on the bilateral dynamics. In other words, what happens in the U.S.-China relationship is not just going to be driven by geopolitics, but you're going to see a growing influence of domestic political trends in both countries. In China, that's growing nationalism, this sort of pro-Xi loyalty sort of atmosphere that's created, this sort of emphasis on self-reliance in China. But in the United States, of course, you have electoral politics, you've got congressional politics, you have interest group politics, you've got bureaucratic politics, all of which is becoming more complicated and more polarized. And so I think that we're entering this era where politics in both countries really will become a new, if not primary, driver at certain points.
Great. Good point to end. And I agree with you. The domestic politics is playing an outsized influence, will continue to. And unfortunately, it's having the result of, I would say, driving the U.S.-China relationship further apart and not closer together, which will certainly make the situation, as Dennis said, even more fragile and a lot to watch. We've covered a lot of ground in 1 hour, and I want to thank each of our experts, Dennis Wilder, Amanda Shao, Ian Chung, Evan Medeiros, for a terrific discussion. And I hope we can convene again at some point here over the next several months. There'll be a lot to talk about and maybe get an update from each of you. But I appreciate your time. And thanks as well to our listeners. And we hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.